And Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Moral action is seldom clear-cut. It requires discernment, it requires sometimes sleepless nights, and we often have to make very difficult choices, and they're very difficult ones to do. The story of Shifra and Puah that's found in the first part of the book of Exodus that we read this Shabbat is a profound example of this. These two biblical characters are two of the most extraordinary women in the moral history of Western civilization, and I'm not exaggerating. Rapidly in the beginning of the book of Exodus, a new Pharaoh arose who was a genocidal anti-Semite. And the Torah gives us scant information about who Shifra and Puah were, but let me quote what it says. It says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names are Shifra and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him, but if it's a girl, let her live." Now, it's unclear what the Hebrew really is saying, and there's two alternatives. One is that they were Hebrew women who functioned as midwives. But a more compelling and logical interpretation is, and the Hebrew is just ambivalent, is ambiguous, that they were midwives of Hebrews. In other words, that they were Egyptians. And here is the amazing thing. They risked their lives and refused to carry out the orders of Pharaoh. And let's quote what the Torah says. "The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live." Now, imagine the moral courage. It's the first recorded in history of refusing to carry out an immoral order. It's a bold act of civil disobedience. They don't do it with any fanfare. Their response to them was self-evident. It says they were God-fearing people, which means they understood there were certain principles in life that you had to adhere to or you weren't a human being. At times, we need to make moral choices. And in this case, it's about living and dying. Pharaoh could have terminated them. That they didn't care. They made a moral choice. Now, the story of Shifra and Puah is a story that's repeated throughout history. What principles do we follow? Are we willing to stand up to authority that calls upon us to violate a sacred principle? Now, a wonderful commentary on this Torah portion took place in Washington this past week. It arose at the Senate confirmation hearings of the Secretary of Defense. And I'm not going to comment on whether Mr. Hegseth is worthy of the position. That's what we pay senators to do. But I do want to discuss the issue of the Shifra-Puah dilemma. The issue arose about Mr. Hegseth's willingness to follow an illegal order, and the exchange was really interesting. Well, I don't know if you didn't see it. Let me read it to you. It's not long. Senator Angus King, the independent from Maine, asked questions regarding international laws of warfare and the use of torture. And King continuously pushed for a firm yes or no answer whether Mr. Hegseth would instruct the United States military to abide by the Title 18 of the current U.S. law that includes the War Crimes Act of 1996. What does that mean? More specifically, Title 18 defines a war crime, I want to get this straight, as a grave breach of any of the Geneva Conventions signed in 1949, including but not limited to the willful killing of a protected person, torture or inhumane treatment, willfully causing great suffering or excess injury, mistreatment of prisoners of war, deportation, hostage-taking. I read this week most of the Geneva Convention. That's what you pay me to do in my spare time. You see this? No, this is not a full thing, but I knew you would quiz me on it. I didn't want to be in. But in any case, the Geneva Convention is something we talk about in war movies, but what's it really about? So King asked, are you rejecting Title 18 and Title 42, I think, also has provisions that incorporate the Geneva Convention and the laws of armed combat. Are you saying that those laws should be repealed? That is the law of the land right now. So Hegseth replied, Senator, we have laws on the books from the Geneva Conventions into the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And then underneath that, you have layers in which standard or temporary rules of engagement are put into place. We fight enemies also as our generation understands that play by no rules. They use civilians as human shields. That's the back and forth. It's a kind of honest answer, but here's what he's saying. In theory, this is what he's basically saying to them. In theory, we follow the Geneva Convention, but in reality, we do whatever we need to win. Now, Hegseth is saying that we are dealing with an enemy who does not honor those principles so that we are able to make exceptions in order to win. Now, this isn't theoretical. In fact, despite U.S. government's claim that it was only targeting terrorists and enemy combatants in Afghanistan, many of the victims of the U.S.-led airstrikes were innocent civilians. Reports show that in 2017, the U.S. relaxed its regulations on airstrikes, resulting in nearly 330% increase in number of civilian casualties. In the aftermath of 9/11, the CIA was given great latitude in dealing with prisoners, forgetting the Geneva Conventions, taking people to some black site, and waterboarding them as long as it wasn't done on U.S. soil. In these situations, were there military personnel or intelligence agents who's objected, and what would happen to them? How many Shifra and Puas were there? In our military, soldiers have a right to refuse an illegal order. And in fact, they're obligated to do so. Of course, they can be court-martialed and their moral judgments can be questioned. The Israeli army is faced with the same principle, with this principle they have of Tohar Nesek. It's called the purity of arms. It started with the Haganah in 1940s, which says, self-defense is our right and our obligation. With all our might, we shall cling to it. And as long as the need persists. But listen to what it says. It says, we shall also be diligent in preserving its purity and rightness. Any misuse of this right harms this most holy of undertakings and renders our defense defective. Our strength lies in the purity of our aspirations and the rightness of our deeds. So here's the deal. I mean, this is not rocket science. Hamas puts weapons and missile launchers in schools and hospitals. Israel gives warnings, but in the end have bombed these installations. Innocents have been killed. How is that legitimized? The answer is our enemies force us to do this. Do you object or not? Some do, and what are the consequences? Do these examples mean that we accept certain moral constraints when it's convenient, but when it's not, we don't? Now, I don't have the guts of a Shifra and Pua. I would venture to say many of us don't. I don't think I would stand up to Pharaoh very well. I'm not here to preach moral absolutes because I have problems with moral absolutes in this situation. I've never been in the battlefield. I have never been part of the national security apparatus of our nation. I've never had to make these decisions. But do we follow international treaties that we have or not? If you're a commanding officer or general or commander-in-chief tells you to do something against international law, what is the Jewish response? Do you act like Shifra and Pua and say no, or what? If it's a matter of life and death, in other words, your life and death, what do you do? Is there a get-out-of-morality card that exists in this world? Now, I think moral and legal clarifications are essential. I think we need to be able to say with some straight answers from our leaders, civilian, political, military, that is what we want to know from you. What do they think? What do they believe? What would they do? How do our soldiers in the field deal with this? Would a Secretary of Defense refuse to do something that he felt was against the laws of war or against international law? How do we respond to the Shifra and Pua dilemma? I wouldn't want to be Mr. Hegseth at those hearings. Now, these questions are not easy, but certainly we must ask them if we want to preserve our nation as a beacon of freedom, to be emulated by the entire world. We need to have moral and legal clarity. We want the world to look at us, because if we're not an example to the world, if we're a nation that doesn't take seriously the Geneva Conventions, no one else will. We need to know what we believe. And I do not think expediency should be the moral code. Now, we are a great nation built on certain ideals. Democrats and Republicans, they share the same ideals. That's why democracy is sacred. It's about government that affirms that we are a nation of law. We need to read and internalize the moral example of Shifra and Puah. If you are given an immoral order, what do you do? What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to stand up for? The question is always, what should we do? It has never been easy to be a person who seeks the moral path of Shifra and Puah, but we dare not give up. Shabbat Shalom. So let us turn in our Sidurim. I think the baby did very well. I want you to know that. You know, I was thinking, what's going to happen if the baby goes wild? But look, I mean, the only thing I can say is that she likes me. I mean, you know, and if babies like you, what else really matters in life? You know, dogs and babies. That's all I care about. And cats. I don't know about cats. You're not allowed to mention a cat in front of me. Okay.